Welcome to the Field and Range Network, presenting the stories and insights of folks who interface with our natural world. Today, I am joined by Eric Ruljancich, whose career in designing and building hiking trails has spanned more than 3 decades. We talk about public lands, wilderness, and the trails that access these areas. I hope you enjoy. Cheers.
We evolved in nature, and our modern world keeps us alive longer and provides all of the kind of building blocks we need for life. One of the things that I think we missed is we're happier when we're connected to nature, and there's some really good academic studies and evidence on this, is that people's level of depression are lower if they get outside time. And we've only been living in an industrialized environment for really, on the historical scale, a short period of time. And so our genetic makeup is to be outside in nature. And I think it's pretty obvious, especially if you in circles where people go outside. For me, outside time is basically my therapy time. It provides a safe place for my brain to kind of let go a little bit. And I think that is something that's super valuable for a lot. And one of the concerns I have, is that urban areas are cool and great and provide a lot of other things, but having access to the natural environment is beneficial. One, because it makes our brains healthier, and two, because understanding what keeps you alive will therefore allow you to better take care of it or steward it. So kind of distill it down into how I kind of see the importance of the natural world. It's not just this thing that keeps us alive, but it's a thing that literally grounds us, and I think can do great things to increase our mental health and make us whole and complete as humans. And I think that might be one of the things that's missing, and why we have basically a mental health crisis, at least in the United States and a lot of the Western world. And it's not that just access to outside is going to fix all the problems. We have a lot of existential challenges ahead, but I do think that the loss of that connection to nature makes staying mentally sane much more difficult, and to not fall into a lot of the challenges of depression and feeling disconnected. Basically alone sailing towards the edge of the waterfall.
If I hear you correctly, some of the answers lay out in nature. Without asking what is nature, let's go there. What is nature?
Sure, if you're going to throw that at me. I would define nature for kind of myself and for this conversation to be, the natural world that is either mostly untouched by us or touched by us, but in ways that try to keep the character of the untouched thing. It doesn't mean that it needs to be, at least in my book, like pristine wilderness that, has had only a few footsteps from humans ever on it, but rather something that is similar to that, but not necessarily so removed from us as humans. So I would consider, like an urban park to be something that I would consider the natural world, because it has natural things, hopefully native things, but not even always, that are growing in it. And so that natural world of all the living beings, animals and plants, and relationships between them, to me, that would be the natural. We're, if we look at it, that we get stuck in the definitions, like we're part of the natural world too, even with all our cities and the sort of the stuff we've built, because we exist within it. But I think what you say, Troy, is like that layer of insulation is big enough that we don't even get to be immersed in it, on that sort of detail. If we be like, we're part of the natural world, but we've lost touch with the actual thing. And so try to bring it back to reality for me is a long time ago, when I was younger, I realized that in the past week that I've been sitting there, I was like, I've not touched anything that wasn't manufactured or modified by human hands.
And that is exactly the definition by the modern architect Neri Oxman. Her definition of nature is anything not produced by humans.
And I would say, yeah, I can be totally on board. And so I made it a sort of mandate for myself that I would try not to go for too long periods of time without touching something that wasn't human made. And it could have been anything. It doesn't have to be living. It could have been a rock. It doesn't matter. It was just part of something that wasn't part of that human construct. And the idea for me was, I've always thought that that part was grounding, and it's easy within an urban environment to kind of lose track of that and get distracted by all the other exciting, shiny things that are around. And so making it a habit, part of my own personal life, that if I wasn't getting that connection, then I'd go out and just touch a tree, even as simple as that. But usually that would give me more time out in an outdoor space. And so this was before I'd read any studies or anything about that. I just knew that that particular space, touching things that were outside of the urban environment, were good for my brain. Turns out I'm not just alone in that thinking.
So, and this is up your alley, where do we find these natural things?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and one of these, one of the critical pieces, like how do we do it? How do we go from a lot of folks living in a super urban environment and providing access to our now defined word that is nature? And I think it has to be pretty holistic, so that we allow everyone to get to. There's a lot of barriers across the way. So we can, I guess I'll just start briefly. So my career is getting folks, in a way, my career is providing opportunities to allow people to have access to the natural world. So in my trail design, in my trail building, in my trail repair work, a trail is a way to interface with nature in my book. Yes, you can interface with nature in a whole bunch of different ways, but take it from me, who's someone who does like to bushwhack and does it for fun sometimes and does it for work sometimes. Just having a chunk of nature nearby and needing to bushwhack really through some difficult terrain to get to is a great barrier for a lot of folks to engage with nature. So the work that I do, I like to think, provides avenues and opportunities for folks to engage in nature in their way. Some people want to go and run, for like 50 miles up tens of thousands of feet of elevation, and that's one way of interfacing with nature. And there might be someone else that wants to go for a couple hundred feet down a trail and sit underneath a tree on a rock and interface with nature that way. So I don't think the work I do has necessarily provides one thing or the other. It provides access in a way that allows more people to interface with nature in the ways that they want. But I don't pretend that that's just the only one solution to the problem of getting people engaged with nature. I think we need to provide on a much bigger scale. So that's one great way. So especially in the United States, having trails that allow us access to our public lands is a fundamental part. And when I say public lands, I can go across the whole spectrum, all the way from the municipality or city that you live in to federal lands and everything kind of in between. And what I really love to see, and which is a new thing that's has quite a bit of support behind it in, say, like the last 5 to 10 years, is what I call urban interface trails. Trails that come out of subdivisions and developed areas and allow people to not even get in their car, but rather walk from their house and get on a trail that is on sometimes, county land, or even sometimes, small parks. Not necessarily, we're not talking like national parks These are small parcels, small places, but they're nature, and they're easy to access. And then the trails allow easy access, not having to get in your vehicle also allows additional access. And so some of these trails are really cool because they provide networks around communities, and then sometimes they connect to bigger trail networks for the people that want to go farther. So in terms of the trail world, that's a really exciting part for me of doing that. But access to nature, I think, needs to go even beyond that. Trails are just one part of it. It's having what we use nowadays is green space, and as much green space within our urban areas as possible. And they don't have to be parks. They can be other little chunks of green space. You can still touch a piece of nature if you've planted a bunch of trees on your street, or you provided other opportunities for plants and animals within your city. So it's not just concrete or black asphalt or metal and steel and concrete. I like those spaces where we've tried to bring in or keep some of that natural environment. So I think that's all part of it. I like to see the whole spectrum from a tree growing on the street all the way to providing as much access as we can to less impacted or more wilderness areas and kind of everything in between. So we go into like a whole bunch of that, but it's basically as much access as we can have, and that's from as simple as being able to go out there and having a kid in the neighborhood find a tree or some grass or some plants and be able to interact and touch those and mess around with them, to full-on stuff that I really love personally, which is access to more wilderness, like rugged, untouched areas, or at least minimally touched areas. That's a very long answer to your question.
What is a trail then? Like what are we talking about? What is a trail? What makes a trail?
Great. It's a good question.
Where do they go to? What values do they access?
Yeah, it's a good fundamental question. A really interesting one, actually, because one of the new avenues I am going to, hopefully in the next month or two, volunteer with a local archaeologist who's working to look at historic indigenous trails in southern Arizona, and they're trying to find out where those paths were, because trails or paths is something that we've pretty much always done as a human being. Is once you have a few humans walk in the same place, a path shows up. We crush down the vegetation, and we open up an easier area to walk. And it's not a new thing. We've been doing it for a really, really long time. Those paths, and especially our ancestors that traveled and moved from site to site depending on the season and what resources were available, would travel. And anyone knows that it's always easy to travel if there's a path there, versus just kind of going wherever and trying to find one. And as humans, we're not the only ones. Wild animals make their own paths. It's not difficult to go out there and find deer and elk and other animals that have made trails. They're quite apparent. I've always said that elk actually do a pretty good job of designing trails on their own. They find the weaknesses through the environment because they're big, heavy animals, and they need clearance to move. So they generally find pretty good paths through the forest, and if we just gave them some saws, they'd make it really good because they can't cut off the logs. So yeah, we're not alone. Paths are what shows up when you have animals traveling in the same place. Elephant paths are huge, massive trampled down areas that make easier for them. So as soon as you have a place where a lot of people are moving back and forth, then you're going to have a path or a trail, and that makes that travel along there easier. It might be easier to kind of put it in a modern setting. Essentially, trails and paths are just transportation corridors. We kind of look at most of those now as not trails but roads, but before we had cars and even before we had carts and wagons, we had trails and paths, and those were our transportation network, and they allowed us to go from point A to point B to point C, etc. Moving kind of forward from that historical sort of perspective, I view a trail or a path is, essentially, if you want to look at it, is a way to travel through a piece of land or a natural environment. And it's really that simple. Now, within that, there can be from the tiniest path that's barely discernible. We're going to start, there's a huge difference in scale between one trail or path and another. So the small is a barely discernible, route that passes through an alpine area, and it's got like the odd cairn, and you can see a few footsteps here and there. That's a corridor route where people have traveled before. It's just very remote, very rugged, and difficult, all the way to trails sometimes in urban areas that are, they're like 20 feet wide and they're designed for lots of people to travel on. But they do the same function. They create an easier path through that natural world. So the whole spectrum in between, and people are out on there, and this is something in the trail design world that we always think about, is who is going to use our trails, because people are out there for, as I mentioned, a whole bunch of different reasons. All the way from just like me sometimes wanting to go touch or sit under a tree, to people interested in watching birds, to people that want to get some exercise, to people that want to do hard and scary things like jump off of rocks, or throw their mountain bikes off of rocks, and many different things in between. So the trail itself doesn't dictate necessarily, what people are doing on it. It's, of course, a contributing factor. And so I look at trails, though, at the end of the day, or the bottom line, however you want to phrase it, is a way for people to access nature, the natural world, and sometimes our public lands. And they're an avenue. All these words have like that double sort of meaning for getting people the opportunity to access with it. Does that sort of answer the question, or do you want me to go into more detail?
That's great. And the trails, from what you tell me, are a solution to the issues and challenges that our society has faced, which we talked about earlier in the discussion. Simply getting people out to nature. Is it that simple?
Well,
so I wanted to ask two more definitions just to build some context.
Sure.
As we keep going, before we fall into any other holes. Trails are found in many places, and many of the ones you work on and involved with are on public lands. What are public lands? And what makes what is the American public land?
Yeah, I don't know.
And I'm curious what they are in Canada as well.
Yeah, I was going to say. So this is a great question.
Why are they special?
Yeah, I'm originally from Canada. That's where I grew up, and we don't have this definition of public lands. It's not even a phrase that exists so much. But let's go back to kind of like the U.S. centric sort of definition, I think, of that particular question, and I would guess that there's probably some variance into what people would answer this question. I'll answer to my definition of what public lands are lands that are owned and hopefully managed by the public and allow access to the public, and that means anyone. And that is, I guess, contrasted with private lands, where you don't have ownership or access to. You actually have no legal ownership or access to. You cannot, unless that owner grants you permission. And so, to me, public lands are the commons, where everyone has access to, and ideally everyone has responsibility for, so that we keep them for future generations. But as part of that ownership and stewardship is that we get to use them, and my hope is that we don't just get to use them and abuse them, we get to use them and protect them, and allow others to have that same kind of access. And what's really interesting in the U.S. that makes it unique is the Wilderness Act provides even a more defined structure of those public lands with creating these spaces that are wilderness. And that's another definition for us. What does that mean? We can spend a long time going into that. We'll make that one really quick, Troy. I think, we can, start looking at all the wording in the Wilderness Act, and then they talk about wilderness character and what does all that mean. I would say, again, we're going to go back to what we talked about originally, is much less touched by human hands. So, or an environment that has very little impact from our human hands and machines and tools. And so it's closer to what it was before humans came on the scene. And creates that feeling of like, oh, there's nothing out here that is sort of human-centric. It is just what it always was, doing its thing that it always was doing. And so that's kind of my definition of wilderness. Ideally, like you don't have access to very much of modern technology, besides what you're able to carry on yourself. There aren't roads, there aren't power lines, there isn't any infrastructure except for perhaps a trail built into this area. Very minimal amount of modification, shall we say, in our wilderness. And so the Wilderness Act creates not only public lands, but public lands that try to be minimally modified by humans. And so access to wilderness, in my opinion, like that is something where I feel like we did it right. Like it's a really good idea to try to keep these areas in a more, I hate to use the word pristine, but more natural state, less modified by humans, because it kind of gives us an example of like, hey, this is the original right over here, and this is where we've modified it, and not necessarily that the modification is wrong or bad, but it kind of keeps everything. It's like a museum in some ways of areas that we haven't touched and heavily modified. A lot of the Earth's surface has been heavily modified by us humans. And again, I try not to put a value judgment on that, but I think it's good to not forget about, well, what did it look like before? And maybe not just what did it look like, what is it like to experience the before? And that's what wilderness, that special kind of public lands allow us to do. And why I really love working on wilderness trails is because allowing access into these places, I think, is a really special thing that not everyone gets to experience, and it's incredibly valuable to see and imagine, what life was like for us humans before we had all the technology available. It basically is a way you can go quickly back in time and have a really intimate contact with the natural world, because there's so much of it there, and you're just the single entity out in that natural world. So that goes back. Public lands are, in my definition, and I think pretty close to the legal definition, places that we all can access and are all responsible for, and wilderness areas are a even more defined section of public lands. Back to Canada, which is a little different, we have tons of public lands because a lot of the country is, because we were a former Commonwealth, what we call Crown land. So I think that we have a different mentality in Canada in some ways. Most of Canada, and especially Western Canada, even more so, the vast majority of everything is public lands, or are public lands. And the only carve-outs are in the urban and or populated and or agricultural areas. So I think it's like in British Columbia where I grew up, it's like it's like 95% of the province is public lands.
Oh, wow.
And very few private lands. So it's a different thing. It feels a lot more raw. That doesn't mean that it's wilderness, because it's not, because Canada is a resource extraction economy, and through mining and logging, ranching and agriculture, a lot of those spaces, even though they're public lands, have been impacted. So they're not quote unquote pristine or wilderness. So let's not get too far into the Canadian rabbit hole here, because that's not the focus. But it's just, I think it's a good question, Troy, to recognize that when we're talking about the U.S. is one thing with its own set of laws and its own set of, we don't have a Wilderness Act in Canada, and I wish we did. So try to not put judgment and just look at these different places who have, a different history of how they came into being, and a different relationship between like private land and public lands, and different laws that protect and or change those things.
Yeah, it is quite a unique privilege and a unique instance in history which has governed not just the conservation but the preservation of our federally designated capital W wilderness areas, and upholding the importance of this conversation is that every American and visitor to this country has a right to go to these public lands. And they're beautiful, they're special, they're museums, galleries.
Mm-hmm.
Trails don't build themselves. Have you heard that one before?
Definitely heard that one, or the trail ferries that go out there and build us trails when no one's looking, and then we get to go use them. So, like everything that is created by human hands, there's a lot that goes into it. So modern day trails that aren't elk trails or aren't cow trails are above and beyond some of the early paths that humans created, are something that we build. And I said, as I mentioned, they're transportation corridor infrastructure, and they're built. And they're built a lot of different ways. So let's kind of start with like my favorite, and that is trails in wilderness, or trails that are far out and are not necessarily of the great big monster size. And that's not saying that those trails aren't valuable. I'm just talking about trails that I like. Those are generally built, especially if they're in wilderness, but sometimes even if they're not, if they're just far out, using hand tools and using technology that's really old. So a lot of the trails that we build basically are using technology from 100, 200, 300 years ago, where we built trails to access different sites and areas that we wanted access to. And a lot of them, especially in the West here, were built for mining, for logging, for ranching, for resource extraction. Remember, trail is just kind of like a small road. It's a transportation corridor. And so early trails were pretty rudimentary and simplistic, and then we started getting tools out there because we wanted to make it easier for us to travel, and then we wanted to make it easier for horses or pack trains to travel, and then wagons. And then to this day, we've expanded the size of our trails to basically turn them into roads so that we can, create a passageway for great big vehicles. But back to what I like to do, which we define as trails, is something that's small, like 16, 24 inches wide, a path. And what I find fascinating, is that we're using basically hand tools and muscle. So those of us that work on trails use a lot of old technology and a lot of just straight human brute force to make that happen, by moving rocks, by leveling soil, by removing some of the bigger vegetation or trees, especially those that are fallen across the ground, to allow us to create a smoother, flatter place to walk. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's flat. Generally it's not, especially if it's in the mountains. but it provides a way to travel that is much more efficient and easy instead of just taking off and trying to walk straight into the wilderness of the natural world from point A to point B. If you're not familiar with a lot of areas, especially in the west, but not entirely, of the U.S., mountains are extremely rugged, and walking from point A to point B through any series of hills or mountains and untouched area can be very difficult and challenging. Combination of vegetation that grows there, combination of the topography, the relief, cliff faces. What we do when we design and build trails is we try to navigate around all those obstacles to create a easier passage.
Great.
And feel free to ask, more clarifying details.
So then, what qualifies a trail to be in good shape?
Good shape.
Versus a trail that's out of shape. What makes for a bad trail?
You mean a flabby, out of shape trail? Yeah.
Sure.
needs
what
to sign
is a
up.
well-designed trail?
So here we go. So a couple different definitions here, and we're talking about the trail world. So we'll start with first question: what's a well-designed trail? And then we'll talk about is a trail out of shape, or why does it need additional support or resources added to it. So in my work and what I strive for, a well-designed trail does a few things. The biggest one is because I'm not creating trails to go to a mine or to go to a logging operation or to go to some sort of other resource extraction. The trails that I generally develop are to provide these experiences or this connection, opportunity to engage with nature. So I want the trails that I design and work on to facilitate that, to facilitate more interaction with the natural world. And so with that in mind, to me, a well-designed trail does a couple things. One, it creates those experiences. So it's not just a straight line blasted through nature, but rather complements it and travels through it in ways that mimic and match what's already there in the natural environment. I like to say that in some of my trail design work, some of my favorite things are trails that sort of unfold themselves as you travel along them and sort of create a story, or like a storybook. It's not like you can see straight for 5 miles and know what's coming. Actually, you come around a corner, you're like, wow, that's an amazing vista. And you come around another corner and you're like, oh, that's a really cool tree. You come around another corner and you see this pile of rocks that looks really interesting. It makes you think of like the fantasy world. So I love trails that unfold and you can't always see what's coming. There's hidden surprises, and sometimes even hidden surprises that you'll see on the 20th time you travel along the trail. You're like, I never noticed that before. Those are, to me, interesting, well-designed trails. They create tons of opportunity for people to have really positive interactions with the natural world, to see things, to hopefully, be like right in there in it and not feel so disconnected from the natural world. Again, imagine the difference between, a 6-lane, freeway or interstate versus a 16-inch wide trail that kind of winds around through the forest. They'll both get you from point A to point B, but the difference of walking along, let's say for this example, an empty interstate and walking along a trail that winds through the natural environment are going to be totally two different experiences. And so I'm going for the latter, the trail that matches with the natural environment. Then a few things else on a well-designed trail is, of course, I'm also thinking about who the users are. So, are the users seeking like thrill and excitement? Do they want like cliff drops and other kind of like really exciting things? Or are the users more interested in, watching birds, and you definitely don't want any cliffs along them because they'll fall off the edge when they get excited and are not paying attention to the edge of the trail. So thinking about the users that are involved, and that's a whole nother rabbit hole that we could talk about later, but So I'm thinking about the users. I want the trail to mimic and match the natural environment. And then the third thing that gets thrown around a lot, and it's a word that I think has been overused, but is a valuable word still, and that's sustainability. My quick definition for that is, how can we minimize the amount of care and attention that this trail needs after? So trails are, because they're part of the natural environment, like we all are, and they're susceptible to erosion and forces that are well beyond our control. And no matter what, your trail is going to, if not used and not regularly maintained or repaired, going to grow over and or wash out. And that's just nature doing what nature does. And so a well-designed trail minimizes how much we have to go in and do that work. It's kind of like, I don't know, like figuring out, like how you can best design your yard to minimize the amount of times you have to go out and work on it and have it still do what you want it to do. So in the trail world, sustainability to me means, what's that maintenance interval cycle? How can we minimize it so we don't need to go out and work on it a whole bunch because we designed it poorly? And we can get down a whole other rabbit hole. That's one of the things I specialize in is figuring out how to mitigate the effects of use and erosion on a trail, and one of the bigger things we deal with. So that's the whole design side. We try to create trails that are sustainable in the end and need more minimal maintenance than others. So that goes to your secondary question you had, Troy, which is, trails that need work or don't need work. And so work or help or love or whatever we want to say are trails where time, erosion, vegetation growth have done their thing, and now the trail is not as accessible or as usable as it once was. So maybe it washed out, maybe it wasn't maintained for a long time, a bunch of logs fell across it, so now it is not an easy way to pass through the natural environment. And what's the cool thing about nature is once we leave it alone, it generally will kind of cover up what we've been doing on it. And since trails are minimal or minimally invasive in these natural places, in most environments, it doesn't take that many years before the trail, which I like to say goes bye-bye, and fades into that natural world and no longer exists. For all intents and purposes, for the person out there, they can't even find it. It's grown over, it's washed out. I specialize in finding those little remnants that are left there, and then sometimes connecting them all back together and then going out and repairing them with the help of wonderful people like Troy, who do a lot of the hard work on the trail to make them come alive again, as it were. And those are, back to that definition, trails that need work are basically trails where we haven't done a regular maintenance cycle. Another layer to add on to it, especially with climate change, it starts to change things. We have a lot more forest fires now, due to a combination of climate change plus a kind of like a zero tolerance for fire in our forests. And so that heavy fire suppression has led to a large buildup of essentially flammable materials that exist on the forest floor. Plus climate change means that we are having lots and lots of high intensity fires, which is really unfortunate and of course impacts these natural environments and impacts our trails as well, and create a huge amount of erosion and damage because those trees, once they are burnt and die, will fall on our trail. The new vegetation grows up quickly and fiercely, which is great because it's a pioneer species and it needs to prevent the erosion from happening, but it generally grows all over our trail too. So post-fire trail recovery is again what Troy talked about, trails that need help. Post-fire, almost all trails need help because they often will get heavily damaged from those particular fires. That's a lot.
Yeah. So you go out and find lost, old, broken trails, restore them, rebuild them, redesign them.
Redesign.
If you have something, if you like talking about design, you're more than welcome to.
Yeah, we'll do a quick introduction here
Sure.
because it's just something I'm super passionate about. So
please.
What choice I like those? That's all. Yeah, that's kind of all that goes on, right? Like within trails, sometimes we're finding or getting tasked with taking trails that haven't had any resources put into them for literally decades, finding them again, figuring out where they were, and then repairing them, opening it up again. I think it's an important piece. Something I'm quite passionate about is. So I love doing that, and I love finding the old trails and bringing back to life. And sometimes those original trails, even though they're old, doesn't mean that they were well designed and that they met some of the criteria that I already talked about. So sometimes we'll be like, we could fix it, but it would be better to design it better in the first place. And that's one of my personal philosophies is like, we could spend like 10 times as many resources to put it, where it was, but we'd have to do all these repairs and build all these structures and do this, or we could figure out how to redesign it and then hit some of those other benchmarks that I, aim for, which is, that better integration with nature, more sustainable, and in the end, it is a cheaper alternative. The one caveat on that is one of the pros and cons of working on public lands, especially federal public lands, as there is quite an extensive layer of protection to make sure that we're not just bulldozing and building crap everywhere. And so that means that doing some of these reroutes can be time consuming on a red tape sort of level, on a bureaucratic level. So it can slow things down or be more difficult. And that's just how it is. But I do see quite a lot of value from sometimes, if you're going to fix it, why don't we try to fix the whole thing and make it a little bit better if we can. So I generally always press in that direction.
Design them, and then you build them. Being a trail builder, and I can say from my own experience, can look like one of those different hat, different day type of job due to the varying types of projects and skills and crafts involved. What hats have you worn? What crafts do you deploy in the field?
Ooh, I like how you phrased this question. So on a funny note, I like hats just in general, like actual physical hats I put on my head, and I have many, which I think probably mirrors the work I do, which is many, many different hats, and why I love it so much. On an initial take, building trails seem like something that's really simple and easy. You just go out there and you dig out path and you're good to go. But when you really get into it, it's a highly variable and to me fascinating environment, because every single foot of trail that you're going to be working on is going to be different than the next one. And the trail itself will have different build qualities, but mostly the environment you're working in and the users that travel along it. There is so much variability, it makes it fascinating. So the hats go all the way from, I think, to be top of your craft, understanding the forces in nature, so gravity, water, hydrology, geology, being able to at least grasp some of the basics of all that geography that's out there, and how it's all working with climate and with gravity that's always has its force on it. So that's just the natural world itself. And then, of course, then you need to understand at least some basic biology, because it's not just usually a chunk of dirt and rock. Most of the stuff where we put trails through has things growing on it. All the way from little tiny mosses and plants to great big trees. All those things not only affect kind of the erosional processes that happen around your trail, but they're also part of that experience that users have as well, and part of that design. So the more that you understand about the natural world, the easier it is to build, I think, quality and sustainable trails. So you got like the biologist hat, and you got the geologist hat, geomorphologist hat, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of those, kind of like natural history sort of disciplines are hats that I like to wear. My academic training is in geography, so it ties in nicely with the work that I do. And then from there, all sorts of fun hats in terms of the actual like building the trails, like anywhere from timber work, and so that's using tools to manipulate, cut, and or put together pieces of wood to build bridges or retaining walls or other structures. Here in the Southwest, we don't do a lot of that timber work, and because timber just doesn't last as long, so we use a lot of stones and rocks to build our structures with. And now you're into masonry skills and fitting things together to make them work, and again, understanding forces that are applied upon different parts of your trail by different users, and using appropriate materials and setting appropriate materials. So you got a whole bunch of stone masonry skills, and then I guess I don't know what hat you would call that, but sometimes it's just the like move dirt and excavate sort of side of things. I also think that another hat to be wearing while you're doing trail work is a anthropology hat or sociology hat, to be understanding how people are going to interface with your trail and how they're going to approach and how the general human being will act when you provide opportunities in front of them. And so some of that I call user psychology or trail psychology, and it's trying to guess what people are going to do on your trail and design your trail appropriately. So the example I like to use that I'll throw out for this hat that might speak to some of your listeners is that imagine you drive up to a big box store because you need to get something like a shower curtain, who knows, and you park, and there's this great big parking lot, right, and it's full, so you're parked in the back, and you can see the front doors, they're like a few hundred yards away, and because somebody wanted to try to create a little bit of nature in this giant black parking lot, they put in a little landscaping. So there's these landscaping strips that kind of split up the parking lot. And you've probably found yourself in this particular place. You park and you see that you've ended up right behind a strip that was planted with some nice flowers and some other bushes. And then the front doors, though, are just right behind that strip. And so almost always, if you look at that strip, you will see what? Well, you'll see small paths that people have trampled over the flowers because they wanted to get to those front doors. So the idea behind that example is if you think that you can provide a straight view of a destination someone wants to go, the front door to the store they want to go and buy their shower curtain, and even if you provide natural environment, people at that time are not really interested in those nice flowers. They want to get to where they're going. And so if you don't provide a path for them, they're going to make one. And so that kind of carries out when you're building trails in the natural world. If you're not building your trail where you think people want to go, guess what? They're going to start building their own little social paths all over the place, or trampling down the vegetation where you don't want to. So that's the psychologist hat, or any of those social sciences trying to understand why people are going to do what they're going to do.
People don't like to step up on things.
Yes. And there's many pieces to that, not just that, yes. So, like steps people avoid. So, we work a lot in trying to figure out how to provide, I call them incentives and disincentives of, like making it look nice and trying to, incentivize people to use the trail how you imagine it, and disincentivize or prevent them from doing the things that will damage the environment. And there's a bunch of different techniques, but just know, that's one of the hats you wear is you're trying to think about how users are going to interface with the trail, and not just blindly create stuff, without thinking about how people are going to use it.
What are some of your favorite disincentives for disincentivizing somebody to go to a particular place?
Yeah, so the best one, of course, is don't allow people to see it if you don't want them to go there. We're very curious animals, myself included, and so if there's a place that is like a sensitive, riparian area or a sensitive site for some reason, has a bunch of mosses or other plants growing that we don't want to have footsteps on because it's going to kill. Then we need to make sure that we just don't provide that nice visual opportunity. So if I have the ability to design a trail and I was like, well, this is a very sensitive area, I'm going to try to figure out how to either make sure that we don't pass close to it so people can go and get there, so not even give them the viewpoint, or if we allow them to kind of see it from a distance, so there'll be less. But what Troy's really going for here is what I like is a big physical barriers are kind of my favorite, and of course here in the desert in the Southwest we have access to pokey things. So big piles of pokey plants are one of my favorite. Sometimes they die and then that sort of thing doesn't exist permanently, but I would say some of the bigger vegetation, especially pokey vegetation, can be great disincentives. And then just big chunky rocks.
So traps.
Yeah, traps, yeah. No spikes. We're not allowed to put spikes. Cliff faces especially, to me, are great places. Most people will stay well away from the cliff face, and so that's a great disincentive, as it were, to use the natural world to, again, have it kind of all fit together so your trail goes through an area that makes it easiest to go, and it's so steep and rugged the other places. That's my favorite disincentive.
Alright, so we'll back away from the design, and we've approved the design, we've cleared away all the red tape, you have your crew around, they have their tools. We're on the backcountry wilderness trails crew, and we're geared up and ready to start our hitch. What does a day in the life of a wilderness trails builder look like?
Hey, well, you might be better off to answer this question than me, since it's been a number of years since I've done a lot of hitches. Troy knows, though, that I like to keep my hands fresh on the tools. And so I would say, and this goes into the other hats you wear, what is it? The flexibility hat. So the first thing of trail work is you need to be flexible on pretty much any project, and that's what makes it interesting, because there's always variables that we can't see coming, and that's what keeps it interesting. Weather can be a huge factor, and finding things that are under the ground that you didn't recognize on the project before you started digging into the ground can be huge factors that kind of change everything. They're like, well, we had this beautiful idea, but now we just realized that like 2 inches, under the soil, there's just this giant pile of rock. And so we might need to come up with some more strategies. So we'll go so I think the first thing is like anyone who's working successfully on trails has a level of flexibility and creativity to solve problems. And then the day in the life of is, of course, why I mentioned that is it's going to vary depending on the project. But typically a backcountry one will involve a decent size hike into the work site because it is backcountry. And that means, as opposed to front country, where people in the front country, you basically can park your vehicle and then go from there, so all your camping gear can stay next to your vehicle, so you don't have to carry it. In your backcountry, you basically have to carry your house and everything else with you to the work site. And that can vary from a couple miles to sometimes, like 20 miles if you're way, way out there. When I coordinate these things, I try obviously not to have crews walk in for 20 miles because that takes a lot of energy and time to get them there. But most sites will involve a pretty decent hike to get there. Sometimes we have pack support, which is nice, and that allows pack animals to carry some of our stuff. But generally, we're the pack animals carrying in all our stuff. So we have to carry in all our food, all our camping gear, plus all our tools, which starts to make for a fairly heavy load, and get that to the work site. And then the cool thing is you're basically on a camping trip or a backpacking trip, plus you're doing trail work. And so you have all those things. So, you're backpacking, and all those things that entails of like fetching water, making sure your food is secured from animals and bears, making sure you have a safe and dry place to sleep. So you got to do all that kind of basic stuff. And then the rest of your day in your life is you're building trail, and that can vary from digging out pieces of grass if you're on a like a trail repair, or even if you're building new trails. Sometimes new trails as simple as digging out grass and a little bit of dirt, all the way to the full other extreme of you're on an incredibly steep hillside that you'll basically slide down, and you're trying to essentially chisel out through all that rock and heavy roots and other debris, get yourself a bench hacked in so that you can walk on. And so sometimes in those zones you'll be building retaining walls because you're so stuck on the side of a hill. The retaining walls help support and create a flat place to walk. So from the simplest, as you can imagine, scraping off a little dirt, to basically excavating a whole hillside so that you can fit in a little flat place to walk, and everything in between. And the rest of the day of life, I'll let Troy answer most of it, but it's quite varied. So usually it's not one or two of those extremes, but it's all those pieces kind of put together. There'll be certain parts where they're really easy build. There's certain parts where all you're doing is cutting off logs. There'll be certain parts where you're just carrying around rocks all day. Variability is the name of the game, in terms of the actual work you're doing. Work days are generally long, and that's to make it more efficient because you've spent so much time hiking out there. It's not that efficient to go hike out and then work for 3 hours a day. So work days are usually around 10 hours. Some crews do it differently. Crews I run, that's to me like about maximum for amount of energy you have to put out in 12-hour, in a full 24-hour day. Anywhere between 8 and 12 is kind of like a standard while you're out there. But remember that once you've all that, then you go back to camp and you got to cook yourself dinner, and maybe fetch water and filter water. So it's not the end of your day. Days are long, and challenging physically. But I always like to say the office is pretty nice, in that kind of like, what do we say, Troy? Like there's nothing like that feeling of doing a physical day of hard work out in nature. There's something that's incredibly satisfying about it, and even people that don't like doing physical work sometimes even say like, that was pretty neat.
Yeah, super satisfying. You carry everything in with you. What kind of food do you like to bring, Eric? What food do you bring? What's your usual? What's your go-to? What are some crazy or extreme variations that you've tried to contend with? Right, you're bringing everything plus all these heavy tools.
Yeah.
So what's the trade-off? What food do you bring?
This is a great question. So it kind of depends. So for me, bottom of the barrel actually is the high-tech solution, which is freeze-dried food that you find in, like outdoor stores and that sort of stuff. Because it's light. Basically, you just pour in boiling water and you let it sit, and then you open the bag and you eat it. So that sounds brilliant. There's two major drawbacks. One, they're expensive for a lot of trips. And two, most of them, even though they have pretty pictures and great descriptions in the back, really taste nothing like we've been advertised to, and they're incredibly salty. I'll interject a fun story. So I used to work friend that worked in an outdoor gear store, and this outdoor gear store got returns, and so some of the returns you couldn't put back on the shelf, and one of the things that you couldn't put back on the shelf were food products, and so one of the things that was returned a bunch were freeze-dried foods, and people bought too much, and they return it to the store, which is kind of annoying, and then they just throw it in this box, and then usually that box would get put in the trash, which is also unfortunate. Anyway, back to this story. A friend knew I was planning a big backpacking trip. And so she's like, hey, do you want me to pull out some of the freeze-dried food out of the box, And I was like, sure, I'll take some free freeze-dried food. So turns out that I ended up with this, like, about 20 packages of this lime chicken with rice that sounded great. Well, there was a reason that 20 containers of this were returned, and that's because when I first used it, I recognized that somehow they had got the ratio of lime wrong. So it was like probably 10 times too much lime, and it was the most nasty thing you could imagine eating. So there's a lot more to the story, but the fun part was that I knew it was bad, but I brought it as kind of the last day of food on a trip, a big, massive, 10-day long trip I did with my brother. And I figured by like the last couple of days, no matter, we were going to be hungry, so this would be fine. And even brought a couple extra spices to like make it taste a little bit less bad. So I think it's like day 9, and I talked to my brother like, hey, we're kind of down to the end here, like our trip's gone a little bit longer. We're going to pull out the lime chicken, just beware. And so 9 days in on like a very physically demanding trip, he's like, I can't eat this. I was like, what do you mean can't eat it? He's like, no, it's so bad, I can't eat it. And so he didn't eat it. He just went hungry that night because it was so bad. And the rest of that lime chicken ended up in my survival kit that I carried around in my car for years. And a lot of food that you leave in survival kits sometimes poach when you get hungry. Well, that food, I never touched that stuff again. It was so absolutely bad that it would have to be the end of the world for me to ever want to open up another one of those. So most freeze-dried food isn't that bad, but it still isn't that good either. So freeze-dried food is kind of like the if I'm pressed for time and I'm just going to get something real quick and really light. My preferred is to try to bring out as many like stable vegetables I can. I'll do the extra weight to get a little bit of vegetable material in my diet, and then I'm kind of old school. Whereas I like just some pasta. Generally cheese and pasta are kind of like my go-to with some vegetables in it and variations of that. And I like to haul out a little bit of olive oil and some spices to kind of kick that up. So that's kind of my favorite kind of go-to. I have thought about bringing just peanut butter because it's full of calories and protein. But I would imagine that after day 2 of just eating peanut butter would probably be a miserable experience. So I've never experimented with that. I don't want to put the interviewer on the spot, but I was going to throw that back to you, Troy. You don't have to answer.
Oh, please. This season, my go-to has turned into, well, I don't bring a stove, so I bring a pound of raw cashews, a pound of roasted, unsalted pistachios, about 10 ounces of beef jerky, no sugar. I found this brand that has 0 sugar. Trying to cut back on my sugar. 3 cans of tuna. Sometimes I'll bring peanut butter. Sometimes I'll bring crunchy granola as a treat. Then maybe a 1/4 pound of cheese or a 1/2 pound of cheese. And I might be missing something. A few bars.
Yeah. So
I like those Perfect bars a lot. Potential sponsor, Perfect Bar. I bring 4 of those, and I don't cook because it's not worth my time or energy.
Yeah, and everyone has their different, preferred thing. That's why it's a cool question. It's kind of like how you want to backpack is essentially it. Like, it's like what you want to do. And of course, after 10 days, 10 hours of doing physically demanding trail work, you're your desire to cook may or may not be there.
I just snack all day.
Yeah.
I'm done when the sun's down. I'm done working. I'm ready for bed.
Yeah, so that's what's cool and neat part about the variability of kind of how people want to do it.
What's your comfort item? What's your one item that you like to bring out?
Good. That's
not necessarily food.
I was going to say, does it's food or not? See, some sort of pillow-like structure, and sometimes because of obviously a pillow is big and heavy and bulky, I generally won't carry a pillow to the backcountry, but I will carry a pillowcase. That is my one little lightweight thing, and then I'll stuff it with a puffy jacket or something to kind of recreate a pillow. So I'd say that's one of my big comfort ones. These days, since I've been doing this a long time, I don't mind carrying a little extra weight for the comfort. So I just bought recently a new fancy inflatable insulated mat for backpacking, and I went and bought the widest and longest I could find. I'm not a great big person, but that little extra room so I'm not falling off the side of my sleeping mat is also one of my little extra things that is worth it weight wise for me, so I can get a good night of sleep.
Awesome. I'll turn back to, so can you reiterate the difference that it makes to the trail builder when they are working in a designated wilderness area concerning the skills and the tools required for the missions?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, we kind of talked about it a little bit before, but as part of the Wilderness Act of 61?
I believe it was 54.
54, all right.
Or it could be 61.
We can look that up. Dates are maybe not my specialty. So back to you. The Wilderness Act has specific legislation within it that defines what you can and can't do. And that's what we're directed by when we do work in the wilderness. And the biggest one is we can't use power tools. So anything like a chainsaw, that's a no-go. Any sort of mechanized, wheelbarrows or anything like that is pretty much not. You have to go back a couple hundred years in history. We didn't have any of those things available, and that's what we get to use. So one of the other things that generally is issued as part of the wilderness is, obviously no rotary hammer drills, no chainsaws, no power saws, nothing like that. But also wheels are something that we can't have either. So that means no wheelbarrows or any other of those. So we're using pretty basic tools and technology when we're out there. So a lot of hand tools that are just swinging tools that you'd swing like a pick style sort of thing, shovels, raking tools. The saws we get to use are all hand saws. Either they're hand pruning saws for the smaller stuff, and if we have larger things in the wilderness, then we're into a whole other area, and that's crosscut work. And these are historic, big metal crosscuts that usually go from about 4 to 7 feet long, and are either used by 1 or 2 people. Big, long steel ribbons that, again, are about 100-plus-year-old technology. And the only reason that we still have crosscuts is a viable thing you can find and use is because it's the main cutting tool in the wilderness, since we don't have access to chainsaws or any other fancy power tools. And then when we're working with rocks and stones, we're again back to pretty simple things. Sledgehammers, chisels, if we want to do any shaping, and pry bars, which is one of our biggest tools because it is a tool and it's a lever. And the lever is a massive boon for us out there in the wilderness, so we don't have to just pick up things with brute force. We can use leverage, and so we use that to move rocks, to set rocks, to move logs, to set logs, and to pry things apart. So that's one of our big tools that we get to use. The lever. Yep.
The lever. What is minimal impact in regarding to our approach in accomplishing wilderness objectives?
Yeah, so I think to define that is, as we mentioned before, the idea of a wilderness area is it provides a wilderness experience. If we, again, build a 10-foot wide trail blasted through the middle of the wilderness, it's probably not going to feel so wildernessy anymore. And so we get away with that. So you're kind of trying to balance two things. You have wilderness, and then there are some, proponents of wilderness to be like, well, no trails should exist at all within wilderness because that's true wilderness, and I can't disagree with that, except that I would add on that I think some areas should be like that. There should be full wilderness, no trails, and we do definitely have areas like that, and they're managed for just basic wilderness, and that's great. However, not many of us are going to be able to access that any longer. And for the areas that we'd like to have access, then trails are one of the least impacting ways that we can do that. And so, back to Troy's question, how do you balance building something that has an impact versus trying not to have an impact within that wilderness area? And so again, the first part of that is design. We're going to try to not design our trail that goes through a sensitive area within that wilderness. And so areas that are off limit, of course, if there are endangered species, if it's a sensitive area that could be easily damaged by humans. So sometimes alpine meadows, sometimes riparian or wet areas are easily damaged by foot and or horse in traffic. So that's on the design phase. And then when we get into the building, not to go too deep down this rabbit hole, when we're building, we're trying to think about, okay, how can we get this particular surface in place? And so tied again a bit with that design, a straight line blasted through the wilderness is going to have a pretty impactful visual scar for people. A trail that winds around and kind of dovetails with what already exists, contours with the natural topography, doesn't just cut out a giant swath of trees, but actually like meanders through the forest, is going to have much less impact, both on a visual level and actually on a physical level. Of the trail. The same thing, all those straight line trails and big things blasted through become water collection points, and they change the drainage system within that particular environment. So you're trying to do whatever you can on the design side to keep it how it was, and to allow access without that access having monster impacts. It, of course, will have impacts. And then when you get down to the actual moving and digging and all that sort of thing, same sort of things apply. Do we need to remove all this material here, or is there a way to get through it to make it not have as big of impact? So sometimes that is, instead of like blasting out a hillside, we'll build a little retaining wall on the downhill side, and therefore have a smaller amount of impact, even though it might take some more different skills or time to construct. It will create a trail that again fits into that environment better and has minimal impact. Same thing when we're harvesting materials, other parts that we want to haul over to our trails, such as rocks or soil. We're going to be working hard to not disturb everything else by ripping apart, 100 feet on each side of the trail to find all the resources we need to build the trail. And then the final kind of bit of that is nature is resilient, and plants are good at growing and regenerating places. And so once you cut in a new trail, you've created an impact, and you've created disturbed raw soil. So one of the things I like to do sometimes is to think about, okay, how can we provide places for new plants to grow back? And so some of the design philosophy that I work with and I teach is we often don't seed because that can be difficult. Once in a while on projects we'll have native seeds that we can plant there, but trying to provide opportunities for the new plants to grow, especially in the Southwest here. That's providing soil and shade and water through the build and design process. And then finally, sometimes I'll also recommend or transplant things in to kind of kickstart that growing part. So it does two parts. One, it minimizes that visual impact of a bunch of raw, disturbed soil. And two, plants hold soil together. So the more that we have growing back on the disturbed surfaces that we've created through the process of trail construction, the more it will look natural, but the less it will also erode in the future. So plants are your friend. and vegetation is your friend to help slow down that erosion process. So always trying to think about how can we have it grow back and look as natural as possible as soon as possible. Great question.
Well, thank you. I'm glad I asked. So, due to the law, we have to use these traditional skills in wilderness areas. And these skills are not exactly commonly taught in this modern age or used. And as you mentioned, even some of the tools that these trail workers use out in the field are 100 years old, such as those crosscut saws. Are we at risk of collectively falling out of practice of these traditional skills that is required to maintain these wilderness areas?
That's an interesting question. At risk, or
where does the knowledge come from? How is it retained? Where is it going?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything's at risk. Certainly, a very, specific types of tools, historic tools and historic techniques, that we need to use in wilderness areas are specific, and certainly, like it is tools and technology that may be lost, as we move forward. I think that one of the cool things about having the designated wilderness is it keeps some of these skills alive, because we need to, just like the crosscuts. So without going into a long, lengthy, history of crosscuts, those saws were originally designed less for doing trail work and more for logging and taking down timber, which has been completely replaced now with mechanized tools, not just chainsaws, but now we have giant machines with huge hydraulics that allow us to either snip or cut down trees in like a second or two. And the difference between using, like a two-person crosscut that might have taken you a couple hours to cut down a tree, doing a couple seconds now. So that technology was developed in the past, and it was the cutting-edge technology of the time. So now we're using, like 100 plus years later, the once was cutting technology. There's a pun there. Cutting-edge technology to work with. Some parts of that, the interesting parts of some parts of that, even that crosscut technology, is those crosscut saws that were being made 100 years ago were made in factories that no longer exist. They were using a super high quality steel that we usually don't get access to any longer because we've used up all of that super high quality steel, or we put it into other products. So they still make a couple brand new crosscuts. They're not really comparable to the old stuff. So yes, eventually we're going to run out of all the old historic crosscuts that we're using. They're probably going to last for at least another 100 years. But if we're around still doing this in 100 years, we might run out of the historic vintage equipment, right? And so at that time, will anyone care enough to make a high quality crosscut? All depends on whether we put importance into doing this kind of work in this way. I think it's valuable to keep some of it alive, just like I mentioned, like it almost being, I don't like the museum is maybe not the word living museum, because it's an interactive, living place where we're going out with these tools and technology. But I think there's value in understanding how we did things before, and understanding of how do things using fairly basic hand tools. Don't get me wrong, it's a lot more work. It's a much more physical, but I do think that, again, it gets you a little closer. The difference between cutting down a tree with a crosscut saw or cutting a log versus using a loud, noisy, smoking chainsaw, it's a different experience. So I think it's valuable, and the law makes it valuable for us, so it's kind of a win-win. I do think that, the crosscut technology and tools are kept very alive. Same with axes is part of that, because generally as crosscut work, you need axes. Some of the other, skills and technique, especially the rock work, is where my specialty lies, and where I think we've lost some of what Troy's talking about, of that knowledge base. I'm always taking pictures when I'm out on trails of old retaining walls or structures, but especially retaining walls. And I've got like a whole series of like hundreds of different photos from different locales and different retaining walls. And I love seeing like 150-year-old or even other retaining walls in other parts, not necessarily in the U.S., but part of the world, that are even older, even centuries old retaining walls, right? That were built using simple techniques, but really high quality work. And so, especially within the Forest Service where I work a lot, I feel like, a lot of the folks that knew that stuff have retired or since left. And there is a dearth of knowledge, not necessarily maybe tools, but that to some degree, but certainly, a lack of really knowledgeable stone crafters out there. And one of the things that I'm working on is trying to create some training programs to bring that back up, so that we can have that style of construction available again. I'm not worried that it's all lost and gone. There's plenty of books and plenty of us out there doing it, but maybe not quite as widespread as I'd like it to be. The crosscut world seems to be pretty alive, and that's partly because the Forest Service has a certified crosscut training program, and quite a intricate structure of teaching that, and a certification process. So that really helps keep that alive. In the stonework, stone masonry, dry stack sort of world, we don't really have that. That doesn't exist. And so it's a little less structured. And I feel like we've, probably because of that, lost some of the skills and maybe even some of the secret techniques that we had 100 years ago, that have been forgotten, lost through time. So I'm not worried about them all disappearing, but I would like us to focus a little bit more on the stonework side of things, while keeping that whole crosscut side alive at the same time.
So more than a builder or a designer, you are also a vessel for knowledge and experience. As I travel to different public lands in different regions, I notice areas seem to be kept at different conditions or standards. So some trails are in better conditions than others in different places. Why does it seem that resources to maintain this access to public lands seem unevenly distributed?
Oh, another excellent question. Let's start at like the very top of that. One of the big ones is how our public lands on the federal level are designated and divided up, and then resources. So you'll notice huge differences between being on National Park Service land versus National Forest Service land versus the Bureau of Land Management, which are our main three types of land you will find yourself on in terms of public land in the country, on the national level. And the Park Service has a much longer history of having a focus on trails and creating what I talked about earlier, which are these experiences for folks. When people think about the natural world, they think about national parks as the first thing. Like you think of Yellowstone, you think of Yosemite, you think of Joshua Tree, you think of some of these really iconic, well-known parks. And why do people go there? They go there because they want to see the amazing stuff. And trails are part of that infrastructure to allow people to see, or Grand Canyon, to see the amazing stuff. And so they have a long history of having that be one of their objectives and having resources to do that. Now, if we look at the other places, and where I really like to work, which is National Forest, which covers much more area than national parks, is the national forest didn't start out being an area that people went for recreation. It was more for resource extraction, logging, ranching, mining. And so trails were built for part of that work, doing all those things. A lot of trails exist because they were built by miners or ranchers back in the day, or loggers. And recreation is sort of, from my understanding, been a little bit slower process coming there. So now a lot of our forest lands are also managed for recreation, but they don't have that same history of being just for recreation. So we're lacking some of the history, and then of course we're lacking that motivation and more so the funding. So we've got less of a history of focusing on recreation in the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, which has even fewer resources for recreation, even though they do have their own trail networks as well. And so you'll see that the Forest Service is missing that history, has much fewer resources per square mile, if you want to look at it, or per acre, than the Park Service, and has these days still a much larger trail network. The trail network that exists in forest lands is I think like a factor of a couple times at least is what in the national park, and maybe even more so. I haven't crunched the numbers. It is amazing difference. So many fewer resources. So it basically comes down at the end is to resources, and the resources are partly from a budgeting side and partly from historical side of what that agency was doing and what their mandate was. So now the Forest Service has shifted a lot to focusing on recreation. For example, down here outside of Tucson, we're in the Coronado National Forest. And a lot of these forests at one time were logged, at least partially logged. Logging or timber sales is not something that's done down here anymore. So they're mostly managed for recreation with a little bit on mining and ranching. But the biggest thing that they're generally managed for is for recreation. But they don't have a lot of resources to pay for it. So as that change has come, we've kind of run up into that wall of we don't have that many financial resources. Therefore, you'll often find that the very best looking trails are in the national parks, and the very worst trails are on BLM, Bureau of Land Management, and the Forest Service falls somewhere in the middle. Now, a few other contributing factors. How close are you to an urban population? Will also dictate how many resources are thrown at that. If you have a lot of users, then it's easier to justify spending money and making those trails. So you'll often find trails that are sometimes in better shape when they're closer to bigger populations, because you'll find more motivated folks who are engaged in working in recreation and trails in those areas, and they can justify hey, we're going to spend more money because we've got a couple million people that might want to access these trails, so it's an easier sell. Back to the end about your vote matters. Voting for governments that prioritize public lands and prioritize recreation, I think is one of the easiest things that we can all do, and to allow us to have access to our public lands. All the public lands in the world are amazing, but if we can't access them, then they're not very public, are they? If there's big barriers or a lot of insulation, as you say, in between. And so that usually takes resources, not just the trail infrastructure, but the parking lot infrastructure so we can get there, public transportation infrastructure so we can get there, toilets, all the other things that go into that infrastructure need to be paid for and maintained for by us, which is all of us, which is where some of our tax dollars go, which I am very happy to pay to do. So back to your question, it all is kind of based on what resources are available for those land managers. And then going down to municipalities and counties, they all have, a different amount of money and different priorities of how much they want to spend on recreation and trails. And so that will generally dictate what kind of trails you see and then how well maintained they are. And some programs had lots of funding in the past, and things changed politically or economically, and you might see, these once were a really elaborate, complex set of trails, but they haven't been worked on for decades and decades because the funding and the resources went away.
Can you identify the entities, organizations, campaigns that exist to defend our access to public lands?
Good. Well, I would say first is being an informed voter and voting for folks that are in support of public lands. That'd be the biggest one. Almost all of our public lands, whether they're at a national level, and usually a national level, have nonprofit support groups. So aside from voting for representatives and or presidents to support public lands, you want to look at perhaps supporting some of those organizations. So most familiar to me, and I work closely with, is the National Forest Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization that supports our national forests. There's also the equivalent of that for the Park Service, and I think it's the National Park Service Foundation. They do the same thing. I'm partial, of course, to National Forest Foundation because I think our national forests need more support than our national parks, but that doesn't mean that we should take all resources away from our national parks. So those are two of the big organizations on a national level. However, if that's too big for you and you like to be closer, almost every community of size, not every, but a lot, have small organizations that help support. So in Tucson here, we have several organizations that work hard to help steward our public lands. And so sometimes those are user groups, like groups of horseback riders form together to form a group to help maintain. Sometimes they're mountain bikers, sometimes they're hikers. Just off the top of my head, I can count 3 different groups that support hikers, 2 different groups that support mountain bikes, 1 group for rock climbers, 2 different equestrian groups, which is the horseback rider groups, and then a couple other nonprofits that just want to protect the natural resources as they are, either for recreation or sometimes just to protect them for all the other animals and plants and wildlife that exist in them. So, and then at some of those, like the bigger level, like the Land Conservancy, which actually buys parcels of land and works to join those up with our public lands, Sierra Club, a lot of the big organizations. But if those are all too big, you can find the same thing on a much smaller level of nonprofits that are supporting our public lands. And there's always room to actually give back, not just with money, but also with attending volunteer events, getting your hands dirty and going out there and doing either maintenance on some of our trails or other improvements to remove invasive species or prevent erosion or to protect our public lands in other ways. And so I would encourage folks that are interested to really look into what's around you locally, because a lot of those small groups are doing really amazing things with really minimal resources. And one of the benefits too is they're really cool communities of folks. So you'll really get kind of hands-on experience. And if you want to give them money, that money will go a really long ways.
Plenty of opportunity to be involved at a local level. As Eric says, if you do some research, basic research, you'll probably find a group that is close to you who similarly loves access to your public lands. But for somebody who has the interest and the motivation to engage at a professional level and make a career out of it, maybe for somebody that wants to be a professional trail builder, what advice do you have for them? What resources are available for an aspiring trail builder?
Cool. Well, yeah, if you think you might like the world of trails, one of the first things is to make sure before you sign up for anything too big that you really like it. And one of the easiest ways is, we were just talking about local nonprofits doing this kind of work. Sign yourself up for a volunteer event doing trail work in some capacity if that's available. That's the very first one. Go to a couple of volunteer events, and that'll hopefully allow you to decide, this stuff is really, really cool. Or you might step out of that and be like, well, it seemed cool on paper, but it doesn't really, kind of work out how I expected, and that's fine. Not everything is for everyone. So that's a great first place if you've never dabbled in this world, is to show up to a couple volunteer events. It's really low investment for you. If you've done that already, or you're just already pretty sure that trails are awesome. I always loved trails since I was a little tiny kid. So that wasn't a big leap for me to, know that I want to work on trails. I didn't know I could make a whole career out of it. And so some of the easy opportunities are working for a youth or conservation corps, and they're basically nonprofits that get young people together, put them on a crew like Troy and I were talking about. They're usually a bit more structured, and sometimes will provide all that food and good stuff for you when you're out there, so you don't have quite the burden to take on, and provide training and support for you to go and do trail work and some sort of other public lands work, depending on the nonprofit. Conservation Corps, or Youth Conservation Corps, or Youth Corps, they're sometimes called. There's national ones, and then there are many, many local ones across the U.S. So depending on where you are, you just start typing in your state and then the word Conservation Corps, and most states will have it pop up, or you'll find nearby states with it available. And then there's a couple national programs as well. So those are great. The big national program, I guess I'll plug here, is the Student Conservation Association, SCA. They run a great program. They have crew work. They also have individual placements if you're not sure you want to be on a crew. And so they're a national-wide program. They work with national forests, national parks, and people all across the country. And then if you want a more local organization, like I say, a lot of the states, especially western states, have at least one, if not multiple, conservation corps available. And they have even programs sometimes for, teenagers, so like 14, 15, 16-year-olds as well, if you're that young and interested in it. Those are great stepping off places to kind of get your foot in the door with no experience. As long as you're willing to work hard and be outside, those are great places to start. And I used to work in that world quite extensively. From there, that will give you generally the opportunity to meet other land managers at different agencies, because you might be working on national forest land, or you might be working on national park land, or you might be working on some state parks. And so I would say, if you're really interested, as many people as you can get to know and talk to and ask questions of is going to benefit your kind of steps into the trail world. And though there are quite a few opportunities out there, a lot of them aren't like heavily advertised. You might not see them on, like job sites or that sort of stuff. So the easiest way is to, start talking to folks. There are also workshops that you can attend. Again, they're limited, and a couple different other programs. If you're really into mountain biking, that's a whole other avenue to get into. So you're less likely to be working in wilderness, because mountain bikes aren't allowed in wilderness, and you're even less likely to be working on all of our public lands. But there's certain areas where mountain biking is very popular, and there are a lot of groups engaged on that sort of thing. So reaching out to mountain bike groups and nonprofits can also be a great way to go. Keep in mind, that volunteering can be a great step to start getting to know some of these people. And so from volunteering or from being on a conservation corps, you can gain some basic skills, but most of all, what you're going to gain is kind of like a lay of the land, and get to know some of the folks that are working in it. And that would be my biggest piece of advice is, try to get as much breadth of experience as you can, and try to meet as many people as you can, and try to ask as many questions as you can about what's going on, so you can, one, start to get a feel for what you might like to do, and then now you know some people that are doing what you might like to do, and then you can ask them for opportunities. That would be my biggest piece of advice, I think.
Awesome. And maybe in post, we can put together a little list of some resources that any listeners could follow that may help guide them to doing this sort of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, if you wanted, you could. Yeah, it's pretty easy to put together a list of some of these organizations that have opportunities.
Yeah, so you've been doing this for like 30 years.
Plus, now, yeah.
Well, I want to hear the story of where this passion started, where it's taking you, and where your this passion energy will go. Where do you?
Great.
Yeah.
So, as I mentioned before, I always had like a connection with trails. I'm not sure if it's because my parents took me on some trails when I was little. I'm not sure if I was involved when my parents were developing their farm, that my dad built a couple trails. Not great ones, but he's not a trail builder, but he built ones that worked. Or maybe it was just me. But I always loved trails from as long as I can remember. So on my parents' farm, when I was probably like about 6 or 7, I got myself like a shovel and I started digging away, and I didn't know what I was doing, and I never even finished. But that's kind of when it all started. So really young. I didn't really realize, nor was I told by society, that was like a good, career choice. That was just something that was like kind of cool. And never really saw it as a potential career choice when I was a young kid, or even when I was a teenager so much. Later on, just before I graduated from high school, I did start working with the Forest Service in British Columbia, and I mostly was doing front-end rec. That means like painting toilets and picnic tables and cleaning up garbage and that sort of stuff. But at that time, I was exposed to, there are trails out there, and some of my work was doing basic maintenance on some of these trails. So that's kind of when I first hit it professionally. But again, I was just using it as a stopgap to allow me to go to university and that sort of thing, and wasn't really considering that I was going to make a career out of, just working on trails. I was like, well, I'm going to do something that's like, I'm going to be an engineer. I'm going to do something more quote unquote, like, high tech, sexy sort of thing. And just to make a long story of my life shorter, I didn't get back into the trail world until after I'd finished university, and after I had worked for a number of years, both as a recreational guide, as a whitewater raft guide. I also taught environmental and outdoor education, all the way from like hiking and backpacking to rock climbing sort of stuff. And realized that as much as I loved bringing folks out into nature and getting them to engage with nature and to do recreation and teaching them about the natural environment, which all those things I loved, I also wanted to do something a bit more constructive with my hands, literally. And so I thought, these worlds aren't so far apart. Like, why can't we do outdoor education plus trail work? And then I can bring in like a bunch of loves in my life all to one, and I think that they complement each other. So before I even worked for the Conservation Corps world in the United States, I formed the equivalent of a tiny little Conservation Corps in British Columbia before I even knew that was happening so much in the U.S. Sometimes it's better the less you know. And for 2 years ran this small program, which was very challenging because basically had to build it from scratch. Little I know that just south of the border, they'd already been doing this for decades. But and I combined outdoor education plus some environmental education plus trail work into this particular program. And it was really successful. And that was basically my jump off point. I was like, okay. Now I built my program, but funding is always really hard for a program. So when the funding dried up, I closed the program down and joined the Conservation Corps world in the United States that was already established and developed. But I had learned a lot of really valuable things before that, because running your own program, a lot of hard lessons learned quickly to make a successful program. And that allowed me to jump into Conservation Corps world in the United States. So I worked specifically in Alaska, and ran a program there, in Arizona, and then helped out with a couple programs in Colorado. And started my own business after doing that for a number of years, with the goal of supporting conservation corps, because I really believed in that mission of engaging young people to learn about the environment and to work on trails, and wanted to work supporting some of these programs. Like a lot of things in life, it didn't exactly work out how I planned, and so people hired me not so much to do that support work for the programs, but rather to teach them technical trail skills. And so slowly my company evolved into moving towards just doing technical trail skills, which I was both excited by and kind of like, well, I still want to engage people. I don't just want to be like moving rocks. The human component of this whole thing is really important. So I've built my company as we've moved towards doing more and more trail specific stuff to provide those strong technical skills and design work and management work, but also with really keeping, for me, on top of the fact that I'm trying to, as part of my my work with my business, is to allow people to engage in nature, and also for me personally to engage with people and to work with people that also share my passions for the outdoors and for accessing the outdoors and for trails. And so one of the things that I've been doing a lot of, and it's always a high priority, is educating folks on how to do a lot of this stuff. So things that Troy talked about, like some of those skills that they're historical skills that may be lost. Training programs have always been a big part of what I do with my company, and I'm really passionate about the crew that I hire and work with that Troy is on. Every time I'm out with them, I'm trying to teach new pieces and new techniques, not just so they can do better work, but the more you know, the more you're engaged. And I feel like, the deeper you kind of go down that rabbit hole, the more you build community, and the more you build like this feeling of belonging in that particular industry, which is here is trail work. And within that natural environment that we started this whole conversation off of. So kind of understanding like how trails fit, and then how this whole giant toolbox of understanding natural environment and trail skills.
And where is this passionate energy going? What, more than just what your goal is, but with all the resources, what would the world look like if your passion had not just all the resources it needed, but 10 times the amount?
No, 10 times. In terms of trails, or we want to go...
Whatever you do, yeah.
So we can expand it beyond there. But if we're on this focus of trails, if we had more resources, I would love, again, to see 2 parts. Well, it's kind of 3 parts. Overall, it's just more engagement. So I'd love it if there were more trail professionals out there, especially on our national forest lands, are definitely lacking in resources for the thousands and thousands of miles of trail. Troy knows this as well. He worked on, lesser traveled trails. So have I. I've worked on trails that probably get, 20 people a year. And that's partly because people don't know about them, and because we don't have the resources to keep them in any sort of condition, to keep the signs in decent condition, to keep our maps up to date, and to allow people to travel on these trails, to promote them in certain ways. So part of that is having the resources to have professionals out there doing really good work, and repairing our trails, maybe building reroutes from time to time, building new trails. So that particular side, and a part of that part that I talked about of being passionate about, is the training side, and kind of like that final part of your question of where I want to go is I love all things trail work. Where I'm growing my company and for myself is to do more and more training. and providing more and more skills. And so I think having a large group of professionals who know their stuff really well would be super exciting for me. And that's not to say we don't have some folks that know their stuff and they're out there, but there aren't that many anymore. Through years and years of budget constraints, especially at the Forest Service, we've lost a lot of the human resources that we had. Those people have retired, not new people have stepped in to mentor under them. So I think we've lost, as you mentioned before, we haven't lost, but we don't have as many skilled people out there as I think would benefit us. And crews out there in good work. And then the other side of that, and that's the volunteer and community engagement side. So the old school kind of thinking, and it's a little bit like it is with MPS, not to get into kind of like the politics of how the different land agencies work. But I think a more holistic sort of engaging the community and not just having, oh, look, here is your recreational facility and we built all this stuff for you. You should just come out and do it and enjoy it because we built everything perfect for you. But rather to have the community involved somewhat in that process. And so that's through volunteerism and engagement in the community. And why I think that's so important is, one, it teaches people that it's a resource there, but even more so, that level of stewardship creates ownership and responsibility towards our public land. Like, this is mine. And now I understand how much work it is to build like a single mile of trail. Man, don't be messing up our nice trails out there. Don't, be out there like damaging the environment, because this is a place that's really special and I care about. And I've given my blood, sweat, and tears, as it were, to it. And so that's the connection part, I think, that's really important for me in the trail world, is I want people to feel ownership, like this trail is their trail too. And this trail and this space is like, this is something that's really important to me and I want to protect. And so resources to allow more folks to have access, and then more folks to give back. So I guess it's kind of like three pieces. Money kind of at the top level, and resources to help support the big professional stuff that volunteers can't do, and having people design and be knowledgeable on that side. And those people are not just living in isolation, but they're interacting with the users that are coming through. And they're also interacting with that volunteer population too that wants to come and give back. And so then you have your group of volunteers that are tightly aligned with the professionals, and then hopefully those volunteers are also representatives for the greater community and just get other users. Not everyone has to give back, but if you're out there and you've got like a really engaged community, especially of volunteers, those people go a long ways towards promoting some of these areas and getting people to have access, figuring out how some of the communities that historically who are poorer or come from disadvantaged backgrounds get access to our public lands can go a long ways from doing that. So that'd be the kind of like the final piece from volunteers, is like, how do we engage communities? And this is very popular to talk about these days, of how do we engage communities that haven't had good access to public lands, either through barriers, financial barriers, or cultural barriers to getting out and using our public lands. And so I'd want to put resources there too to get some of those folks out, because there are people and kids out there that never had that opportunity to go out and hike on a trail like I had the privilege when I was a little kid. So that's where I'd want to put my resources, kind of split into those three different pools.
That's awesome. Really, you've been meditating on this. That's awesome. I'm glad I asked. It's a really fine place to end. Other than, I would like to ask, back to nature, and maybe it does have lessons for our society and us as individuals. What lessons have you learned from nature and your time in the wilderness? What's one?
One.
You can give me two. You can give me two. You can give me two. Or three.
You can cut out all the rest. I think the biggest one for me personally is what I talked a bit about before. I think nature has kept me humble, and through the fact that when you're out in nature in whichever form you want, whether you're recreating or you're working on a trail, you're still out in nature and you're dealing with the natural environment, makes me feel at one sort of viewpoint or one perspective, like I feel really, really small within that giant space. I'm like, man, I'm just like tiny. But at the same time, I feel super connected to it. So both insignificant and really important at the same time, which are like, two different things to hold on to. And so that feeling of recognizing really how small and insignificant we all are, but at the same time feeling part of some bigger thing, which I think is just being alive and being in that natural world, I think is a really humbling place to come from, and can certainly help at least me bridge those two gaps, because then I think both of those feelings are quite common. We really desire community. Most people desire community because we're social beings, but we have a big bunch of brain all up in there thinking all the time, and it's not hard to recognize that out of the billions and billions of us, we're just one single organism wandering around, to feel like, well, it's just kind of meaningless. And so that, what I'm calling humbleness, I think is like one of the biggest lessons that I personally get from being out there. And I'll do a kind of a second one, but not too far, because there's a lot of lessons you can learn from being in nature. And that is how important it is to not get stuck in one particular trap of thinking of like things have to be this way. When you're out in nature, you quickly find that all your best well-laid plans need to be modified quickly because something changed, or you didn't have enough information going in to the experience, and so you have to modify things, right? Or your body just doesn't do what you planned it to do. You're like, well, I'm too tired, I can't actually do that 30 miles I plan to do every day on my great big wilderness hike. And so I suppose that ties a little bit into humbleness, but it ties into learning that you don't get to drive the ship all the time, and rather it's staying flexible and open to doing different things when you're faced with the realities. You just can't do that. It's like, well, we planned we were going to climb up over this pass, but there's just no way. It's all full of snow. We can't do it right now. Oh, it's all full of vegetation. We can't do it right now. And so you need to modify your plans quickly. So no matter how good your plans are, you're probably going to have to change them. And I think that's a really good rule for life, not getting stuck. Because after being on this earth for a good number of years now, almost nothing I planned has really worked out exactly like I thought it would. Well, that could be depressing. It's just kind of wonder of the world that it will continue to stay active and dynamic. And then the sooner you recognize that, the better things get, instead of getting stuck, being disappointed that it wasn't how you planned.
Wisdom.
Something.
Nature wisdom.
Yeah.
Well, Eric, that's all I have. Do you have anything else on your mind?
No, I think you had me talk for plenty of time, so I appreciate the chance to share some of my ideas and passions about the natural world, and certainly about trails. As I tell everyone, I can talk about trails till everyone is fast asleep. So really appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit of how I feel about this, and thanks for the good questions, and listening to some of my long responses.
Thank you, Eric.